June 30th, 1692 was another very busy day in the courtroom at the Salem witch trial. Welcome to the Salem Witch Hunt Daily Report for June 30th, 2024. I'm Josh Hutchinson. On June 30th, 1692, the grand jury heard the cases of Elizabeth Howe, which continued from the 29th, Sir Wilds, and John and Elizabeth Procter, and the trial jury heard the cases of Elizabeth Howe and Sarah Wilds. Robert Downer testified that Susanna Martin once told him some she-devil would fetch him away shortly. Soon after this, Downer was assaulted in bed by a cat-like apparition. When he said, "Avoid, thou she-devil, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost," the cat thing left him. Mary Andrews said she'd also heard Susanna Martin threaten Downer, and Moses Pike claimed he had heard Susanna Martin talk about what had happened to Downer the day after his encounter with the cat. In the case of John and Elizabeth Procter, Mary Warren said that Elizabeth Procter had often bewitched her, and that she'd seen Elizabeth attack Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, Ann Putnam, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams. Stephen Bittford was deposed against Elizabeth Procter and Rebecca Nurse, who had already been convicted the day before, whom he accused of visiting him spectrally in April. During the visitation, he was unable to stir or speak, but felt great pain in his neck, which continued for 2 or 3 days after the visit, with him having trouble moving his neck. In a deposition, Elizabeth Booth claimed that Elizabeth Procter had afflicted her on June 27th. Elizabeth Booth also testified that her deceased stepfather, Michael Shaflin, appeared to her and blamed Elizabeth Procter for killing him, because she was not sent for when Shaflin was first taken ill, and because Alice Shaflin did not send for Dr. Griggs. Elizabeth Booth also said that Robert Stone Sr.'s ghost came to her and told her John and Elizabeth Procter had killed him over an accounting dispute, and Robert Stone Jr.'s ghost told her the Procter couple had killed him because he agreed with his father in the accounting argument. Elizabeth Booth further testified that Hugh Jones' ghost blamed Elizabeth Procter for killing him because he took a pot of cider without paying. Elizabeth Shaw's ghost blamed Elizabeth Procter and John Willard for killing her because she would not use the doctors they wanted her to use, and the ghost of John Felton's wife, Mary, claimed Elizabeth Procter killed her for not giving her apples, though John Felton himself signed a petition in support of the Proctors in real life. In addition, ghost of Zerubbabel Endicott supposedly manifested for Elizabeth Booth and said Elizabeth Procter killed him too, and attempted to kill his wife, but only injured her. The reason he gave was that he and Procter had disagreed over how to treat Thomas Ferry's wife, Elizabeth, who was daughter of John Procter and his second wife, Elizabeth Thorndike, not to be confused with his third wife, Elizabeth Bassett Procter, who was the one who stood accused of witchcraft. Mary Walcott was deposed against Elizabeth Bassett Procter, saying that since April 11th, when Procter was examined by the magistrates, the apparition of Elizabeth Procter has most grievously afflicted me by biting, pinching, and almost choking me, urging me to write in her book. Sarah Bibber said John Procter afflicted her on June 3rd by pinching, pricking, and almost pressing me to death, urging me to drink a drink as red as blood, which I refusing, he did torture me with a variety of tortures. Mary Warren said John Procter hath often tortured me by pinching me and biting me and choking me and pressing me on the stomach, till the blood came out of my mouth. The April 11th depositions of Mercy Lewis, Ann Putnam Jr., Samuel Parris, Nathaniel Ingersoll, and Thomas Putnam against Elizabeth Procter were sworn in court before the grand jury. Elizabeth Procter was indicted for afflicting Mary Walcott and Mercy Lewis, and John Procter was indicted for afflicting Mercy Lewis and Mary Warren. The grand jury declined to indict him for afflicting Mary Walcott. Elizabeth Howe, in her case, the grand jury made a decision indicting her for afflicting Mary Walcott and Mercy Lewis. However, most of the testimony had to do with neighborly disputes followed by mysterious accidents or illnesses, just as in the case of the Proctors. Nehemiah Abbott Sr. testified against Elizabeth Howe, saying that after any differences with James Howe's wife, Elizabeth Howe, often evil occurrences did follow. As evidence, he told about how some livestock had fallen ill. Elizabeth Howe's nephew, Jacob Foster, said his father, Isaac, was instrumental in blocking Elizabeth from church membership in Ipswich some years ago. Jacob found his mare standing with her back to a tree soon after, looking miserably beaten and abused. Elizabeth Howe's brother-in-law, Captain John Howe, said that when Elizabeth was arrested, she wanted him to go to Salem village to be there for her examination the next day, but he refused because she was charged with witchcraft. He would have gone there for any other reason but witchcraft. So instead of supporting his sister-in-law, he asked her to tell him how long she had been a witch and what mischief she had done, because multiple people suspected her. The next day, after Elizabeth had been jailed, John returned home from an errand in Ipswich, only to be there to see his sow jump high in the air, squeak one time, and die. In a bit of counter magic, John cut an ear off the sow. Rather than helping anything at all, this only made John's hands sore for several days so that he was unable to work. Francis Lane testified that in around 1685, James Howe hired him to get some posts and rails, and Lane hired John Purley, son of Samuel Purley, to assist. When Elizabeth Howe learned John Purley was involved, she said that the posts and rails would not do. Accordingly, when James Howe went to take delivery, the posts and rails fell apart, and Francis Lane was forced to find more on his own. Martha Wood testified against Elizabeth Howe, claiming Elizabeth had bewitched an apple and used witchcraft to steal drink from the Woods' vessels. The June 1st deposition of Ruth Purley and Samuel Purley against Elizabeth Howe was sworn in court before the grand jury, as was the June 1st deposition of Timothy Purley and Deborah Purley, the May 31st deposition of Joseph Stafford, and the 3 depositions from June 27th of Mary Cummings against Elizabeth Howe, the June 25th statement of Daniel Warner, John Warner, and Sarah Warner for Elizabeth Howe, the June 27th statement of Joseph Knowlton and Mary Knowlton for Elizabeth Howe, and the June 28th statement of James Howe Sr. for Elizabeth Howe. Regardless of these statements in support of Elizabeth Howe, the trial jury convened and convicted Elizabeth Howe. In the case of Sarah Wilds was indicted for afflicting Mercy Lewis. Brothers John and Joseph Andrews were deposed at length against Sarah Wilds. They said that back in 1674, when they were teenagers, they attempted to borrow a scythe from John Wilds Sr., Sarah's husband. However, John was away from home. A neighbor suggested they take John Wilds Jr.'s scythe and then ask permission when they passed him on the way back to their field. When they told Sarah Wilds of their plans to do this, she supposedly railed at them, saying, "It was a brave world that everyone did what they would." After the Andrews brothers took the scythe anyway, a very young Ephraim Wilds told them his mother had said they'd best bring the scythe back again, or else it should be a dear scythe to them. John and Joseph continued on their way and found John Wilds Jr. They asked his permission to borrow the tool, and he granted it. After they had finished reaping hay and loading a cart, their 6 oxen struggled to move it. Then a wheel fell off. Then the oxen were frightened by something like a dog, and Joseph was frozen in place while the oxen charged down a hill and over a brook, throwing all the hay out of the cart. When John got Joseph to come to, the brothers reloaded the hay, but couldn't get the cart rope to tighten over the load. The April 22nd depositions of Ann Putnam Jr. and Mary Walcott against Sarah Wilds were sworn in court before the grand jury, and Sarah Wilds was unfortunately convicted of witchcraft. Thank you for watching today's Salem Witch Hunt Daily Report. Have a great day and a beautiful tomorrow.